Thank you very much. I'm going to be the second Sam of the day talking. I'm Sam Hogarth, and if you can't tell by my accent, I know it's softened a bit through university, but I am a Geordie. I am a local person. I've been doing software development for about 10 years now, which is a bit scary. I've been working at Tesco Bank since May last year, and although I'm a developer and I'm interested in kind of DevOps and Java and TypeScript, I'm actually also really interested in Agile, and this talk is actually me trying to figure out the retrospectives part of Agile development and how we can make retrospectives better for the team. A little bit about me. I'm also the weird Halloween kid on the street, and by that I mean this was my house this year. This keeps me out of trouble from about May, June-ish and every year. So, this year we went for a witch with a bubbly cauldron and a little fire effect. It was really, really nice. But you're not here about Halloween. I could probably talk for half an hour about that. I've noticed the following kind of downward spiral that can happen with retrospectives, especially as teams have deadlines nearing. So you will raise actions in retrospectives and people are just too busy, so they stop getting done. And then at retrospectives, this is people cotton onto this, right? And then say, well, we shouldn't bother raising any actions because they're not going to be done. And then what happens is retrospectives just become somewhere where people go to have their 1 hour permitted fortnightly moan. And eventually that gets boring too, because it's boring and people start showing up. And then eventually the managers cotton onto that and the retrospective itself is cancelled. So I've seen this, I've done this, I've been there. What's actually the point of a retrospective? Why do we do these things? It's not to have that fortnightly moan. It's to create happier and motivated self-directing teams. The whole point of a retrospective is that you are taking some time to listen to what's going on and then improving the ways of working, improving your processes. And the idea is that you, as a team member, should be the one who's empowered to make this change. You're not asking for permission from anybody else. You're doing it yourself based on problems you're encountering. I'm going to be talking a lot about Scrum, not because I advocate Scrum in particular, just because I think it's kind of a bit of a common starting point for everybody. But the Scrum Guide itself talks about inspecting and adapting. And at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. Now, this doesn't just happen in retrospectives. This happens all over the place throughout your Agile development practice, but obviously we're focusing on retrospectives today. So to put this into context, if you take a look at Scrum, you will kind of see this loop that happens where you will set a sprint goal, something that you want to achieve in the next iteration, and then you will conduct a sprint towards that goal. Out of the sprint comes a product increment, which you'll then take for review, and that's where you have your demo and you'll reprioritize the backlog, and the business will tell you whether they're happy with it or whether they need to make more changes. And then finally, you have a retrospective, and it's kind of curious that it separates the two things. So you've got the review of the product and a review of the process as separate steps. This simple loop has actually occurred multiple times in history. So if we go back to the kind of lean manufacturing movement, you would have heard of plan, do, study, act, or plan, do, check, act. And it's exactly the same loop that goes on there, but just with higher level business processes. And from the military, there's a term called OODA. And I've had to kind of rejig these to make them fit, but it is fundamentally the same loop. The interesting thing about the OODA loop, for example, the observe, orient, decide, act loop, is that it's designed to acknowledge that in a warlike setting, you have a competitor who is taking actions to try and defeat you. In the space that we work in, we understand that when we build a product, we have competitors. And the interesting realization from the OODA loop is that the side that is able to go through this loop quicker is able to gain that strategic tactical advantage because it is able to listen to feedback and react and adjust to it accordingly. So the interesting thing about this loop, I find, is actually that there is a competitive advantage to being able to do this, because if you don't, your competitors are going to do this and take away your market share. But if you think about it, like, why is it that this loop is reoccurring all the way through history? Well, actually, it's essentially the algorithm of empiricism. It's the scientific method of coming up with a hypothesis, running an experiment, doing an analysis, and then performing an evaluation. And I find this really empowering as a developer, because I like science, and I like to know that there's not only the economic argument for doing this, but there is also the kind of sound scientific principles about why we are wanting to kind of create better teams and learn from the feedback that we're kind of receiving. It's why I call feedback the engine of agile development. And like I said, feedback occurs at multiple stages throughout your agile process. We're just focusing on the retro today. But the important thing, and why I've likened this to a person pushing a ball up a hill, is that it is a continual process. And if you stop doing it, because everybody else, all your competitors, are also kind of running their own loops and improving their own processes, if you just stop doing it, what actually happens is you get entropy, a gradual decline into disorder. As soon as you leave go of the ball, it rolls down the hill. Before I talk about actually planning and running retrospectives, I think it's worth talking about the global bastard. So this talk was originally designed when we were all allowed to be in a room together and put things on whiteboards and move things around and kind of talk and hug each other and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, the pandemic has put a bit of a stop to that, but we are really lucky that there is a whole load of tools out there which can very closely recreate that tactile feel of moving stuff around on a board. These are the ones that I've personally tried. Some of them you have to pay for. I want to pay kind of specific attention to Microsoft Teams, because about a year ago, Teams was an absolute laughingstock, but they've really got their act together now. And there's like a virtual whiteboard feature in Teams, which is just really, really useful if you're in a meeting and you want to just spin up a little bit of scratch space to write something down. Taking that to its logical extent, you have Miro, which is like an interactive infinite whiteboard, and you can put shapes and writing and post-it notes and all that kind of stuff on. What's really nice about Miro is that it's really generic. It's not just for retros, but it has a facilitator mode. So the facilitator can kind of set everything up in advance on this big whiteboard landscape and then move everybody else's view around to the bit that they want to focus on. So I really, really like that. But there's also tools like Retrium and Team Retro, which are specifically set up for retrospectives and have like a bunch of pre-configured templates that you can use. But when it comes to planning a retrospective, the book by Esther Darby and Diana Larson kind of covers 5 phases that a retrospective goes through, and you will go through these phases regardless, but it's useful to call them out. And if you're designing a retrospective, come up with different actions that occur at each of the stages to try and get the information that you need. The reason that you go through these stages is that you start a retrospective with some kind of problem statement in a very generic sense. And what you're trying to get towards is a decision. In order to do that, we're going to go through a process of divergence. This is from systems thinking. This is where you will all generate kind of different perspectives and different opinions on how we should do things. So we kind of consider all of our options. That opens up the problem space. But then we need to bring it back together so we converge on some kind of decision. And what I like about the kind of 5 acts in the Darby Larson book is that this fits pretty closely. It's not discrete. There is some overlap. But it fits pretty closely to what each of these stages in the retrospective is deciding is trying to do. So you start off by setting the stage. Why are we here? What are we trying to do? We then, as we diverge, we gather data and generate insights about that data. And using the insights, we converge again, decide what to do, and then bring the retro to a close. I wanted to call out one particular tool that I really like using myself when designing a retro. It's Retromat. This is like going to the bookies and pulling the arm down on the bandit. So what it does is it generates from a community collated bunch of submissions a retrospective, and it explicitly says, here's the exercise you do for the set the stage piece, the gather data piece, the generate insights piece. And yeah, you can just kind of YOLO it, print that out and run with it. I like to press the random button and then tinker with it a bit just to make sure that it makes more sense and it has the right kind of feel. But that's an absolute vital resource, to be honest, if you're designing retrospectives. But what I want to do for the rest of this presentation, and I want to leave a lot of room for questions as well, is go through each of these stages and talk about what we're trying to do at each stage and how we can draw people to getting meaningful insights from their retrospectives and then generating actions that are actually going to make meaningful change. So we'll start with setting the stage. The first thing I like to do, and this is really cheesy, I'm going to admit that, it's from a book from the 90s by Norman Kerth. This was written at a time where retrospectives were called postmortems, and this book was actually the change in terminology to retrospectives. But it was done in a time of traditional waterfall, where you'd undertake a big project and then have a postmortem at the end. But there's a lot of useful insights for agile processes in here as well. Norman talks about the concept of psychological safety. He doesn't use that term, he calls it the prime directive. It's useful to state this at the start of a retrospective. It's that regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. That's important because retrospectives are not about finding blame. They're about finding root causes, but those root causes are very rarely individuals. And you're still going to be a team after the retrospective. You need to work together. So it's important that we conduct these investigations because they are going to be emotional, they are going to be very thorough, but they're done from a perspective of improving the team. They're not done in terms of pointing fingers and finding blame. And on that, what I like to do normally before the retrospective, so that people can have a bit of time to really chew on this, is I'll conduct some kind of safety survey. So you can do this anonymously in things like Teams or Google Forms, or even in the real world, just with a postbox and cards. But I'll ask people to rate where they're kind of feeling on a scale of 1 to 5. And you can put some examples of what those numbers mean. So in this example, this is about kind of how willing are you to talk about issues. And what you can do is, as a facilitator running the retro, is you can have a look at these and just see where the team lies. It's important that they're anonymous. If you have a team which is all 5s and 4s, then that's a really good sign that you're going to get some use out of a retrospective. But if you have people in 2s and 1s, maybe a retrospective is not actually what you need now. Maybe you want to spend some time instead trying to establish psychological safety. Maybe have a session which covers ground rules, come up with a team charter, try and do some discovery activities to work out what is it that's causing this lack of trust or this lack of comfort. In the past, I've seen this kind of stuff happen where if you suggest that the managers are removed from the retrospective, all of a sudden psychological safety jumps up. So there's multiple reasons why this can happen, and that's for you to find out. What you're interested in is not identifying who's the number 1 or the number 2 here. It's more about the shape of the team. And as you go from retro to retro, understanding kind of the ebbs and flows of that. Are we trending towards being able to talk more comfortably with each other, or are we getting more closed and insular? The set the stage scene is also where you'd kind of go over the previous actions of the retrospective and then maybe cover the agenda that you're wanting to go over as well. One thing I like to do is I like to start off by going around the table and asking everybody to say their name and then some inane fact about themselves, like what's their favorite color, what was the last piece of music they listened to. The good thing about this is it gets everybody talking at the start of a retrospective. And yeah, it's about, it's not relevant to the meeting at hand, but it just kind of clicks in their brain that I've now spoken in this meeting, so speaking again is not as hard. It stops people from just staying silent. So without having any kind of data, we can only speculate as to what our problems are. So we have a formal gather data exercise. Now this is typically where you'll see this 3-act structure. You put your 3 columns on the board: what went well, what went badly, and your actions. What should we do differently? Now, personally, I'm not saying this is bad. I think this is really, really common. If it's done all the time, it can get boring. It is a useful bounding context, but just by putting the 3 columns up like this, it doesn't give a huge amount of direction to create the actions. It's definitely a conversation starter, but nothing more than that. And what I don't like in particular is having this actions column. I think it's too soon to be drawing actions, because all we're doing here is generating data. We haven't gone through the kind of come up with the insights and draw parallels and conclusions and identify themes. We haven't done any of that yet. We can't just scatter data on the ground and then try and draw some actions from that. So there are alternative ways you can do this 3-column structure without kind of jumping straight to the end, as programmers like to do. There's a problem, we find the solution. Hold off on that. So you can kind of go on feelings. You can do mad, sad, and glad, or you can do dare, share, and care, or you can ask people what did they like in the last iteration, what did they learn, and what did they lack. But there's other formats other than this kind of 3-column structure. One thing I really like to do, and this is a good one because you can actually do this over the sprint and then bring it into the retro, is draw a timeline. What happened during a sprint? So here's an example one. This is actually a real thing. So a production incident, requirements change midway through, and then we achieved some kind of key piece of enabling technology right at the end of the sprint. What's interesting about drawing this on a timeline is, like, you'll be surprised, but everybody in the team has different perspectives on what happened during a sprint and different memories of that as well. Like maybe the QA team had no idea that the DevOps team had done this big piece of work right at the end, So this kind of helps establish this common understanding of what went on. And then you can actually do things like augment this as well. So you can ask the team, let's just draw a chart about how they felt, over the course of this sprint. What bits made them happy? What bits really cheesed them off? Again, this is just generating more data for you to draw insights from. I apologize here for my really bad Microsoft Paint, but I like this sailboat exercise because for new teams, maybe established teams that are losing their way, this is a really good focusing piece to help us understand, why are we here? Why are we doing this? Why us? The idea is you draw a boat, that's us, that's the team, and we are sailing towards some kind of island. That island is our goal. Where are we heading? And again, you'll be surprised that different members of the team may not have the same understanding of where we are heading. So again, we're establishing common understandings here. We look at the wind in the sail. What's driving us forward? What's propelling us here? We can look at the anchor on the ship. What are the things that are holding us back from reaching our goals? And we can look at the icebergs and we can say, what challenges do we know are on the way? And you can extend this as well. You can draw kind of rocks underneath the sea and, what are we afraid of? So this is a good way of kind of making people think, like take a step back and think about the bigger picture and just try and kind of recalibrate. So there's loads of ways that you can gather this data. What you then need to do is generate insights from that data. This is where we're looking to kind of establish these root causes. What is it that's actually going on here? What are the problems that we need to fix? Because a lot of the times, problems that are raised in a retrospectives, they can tend to be a bit superficial. They're not necessarily the root cause of what's going on. So, for example, if a issue is raised that the code review process is taking too long, the issue there might actually be something more fundamental. It might be that some developer is using the code review process to grandstand on pointless issues like the exact style that we use or the naming of variables. Or it could be that we're organizing our work in too large of a chunk, which makes reviewing it an absolute pain. And that is meaning that the testers are having all their work pushed at the end. Without kind of analyzing this and trying to establish the root cause, we really risk only fixing the superficial issues and not actually fixing the root causes. So from the lean movement, there's this idea of the 5 whys. And this is kind of when you get a problem, almost like a toddler, you kind of keep asking why to try and get to that root cause. Just like I did before there with the code review example. If you want to kind of not be annoying when doing this, you can each time reword and restate the problem. And that's good because that helps you think about it differently. And what you're trying to do here is you're trying to narrow in on more impactful actions. Now, from my experience, I found that asking why is sometimes a bit too kind of forceful. And remember the prime directive, retrospectives are blameless. I think it's quite easy when you're asking why to get down to, well, this guy over here messed up. So I've started, instead of asking why, asking how. But there's other ways you can do this as well. So there's the fishbone example where rather than asking why or how X many times, you can start with a problem, you can draw it out, and you can go through all of the other kind of sense-making questions. So you can ask, what is it? Where does that happen? Who's involved? Why is this happening? And then how? And that can help you kind of tease out all of the various aspects that are going on here. One of the things I found when generating insights is that it's really easy for loudmouths like me or really opinionated people to dominate a conversation and kind of basically steamroll the entire process. And what you want to do in a retrospective is you want to gather everybody's perspectives and everybody's feedback. And sometimes having 10 people around a table is not the most productive means to generate those insights. It means minority opinions can sometimes be ignored. So from the book, The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures, there's a technique called 1, 2, 4, all. And what's good about the online tech now in things like Zoom is that you can create breakout rooms which enable this. I mean, this stuff is really easy when you're in a physical space, but the tech is getting there as well. The idea here is that you split up into groups. You start off by having yourself as an individual look at some kind of question. You set a time limit as the facilitator. You say, okay, you've got 1 minute to kind of think about this and put some kind of thought together. And then you join in groups of 2 and you collate those thoughts and you can talk about them. And you can say either we bring both of them forward or you want to kind of choose what you think is the most important or most impactful insight from that. And you can keep doing this. So you can then go to 4 people. You do the same process. And then eventually you get to bringing everything together in plenum. The idea here is that maybe one of the individuals put forward a really impactful opinion, but they wouldn't have felt comfortable raising that in a full group. But because it's going through all the different stages, other people in that process along the way can kind of pick up on that issue, champion it, and make sure that it gets raised accordingly. And it also acts as just a useful filtering process as well, because it means that when we all come back together, what we're talking about is inherently the most important stuff because it's gone through this kind of, it's gone through this kind of filtering process. What you're trying to do with this is identify the themes that are going on, try to get at the root actions so that you can then decide what to do. And this is where I think a lot of retrospectives go south, because I see teams generate loads and loads of actions from retrospectives, or I see teams kind of complain that, actually the problem is not this team, the problem is the wider organizational context. So what's the point? And yeah, when you have issues that are outside of your ability to affect them, that can be really demotivating and demoralizing. And as a facilitator, it can be difficult to pull people back in when they start thinking like that. But it can be done. And I like to think of the Stoic philosophy of give me the wisdom to change the things that I can, the knowledge to know the things I can't, etc., etc. In kind of the psychology circles, we'll talk about a circle of influence and a circle of concern. There are a lot of things in the world that are going on right now that we are really, really concerned about. But when we think about it, we don't have much ability to change them. But on the other hand, we do have a bunch of things that we are worried about, but are in our direct ability to change. As a team, what you are wanting to do in a retrospective is identify the issues that are in your circle of influence so that you can affect that change. And by doing that, your circle of influence grows wider into your circle of concern, because you can kind of do things like lead by example, you can trailblaze, you can basically grow your team's capability to enact change. Outside of the circle of concern, by the way, is just this void, and that is the way things are. And you may not be interested in changing them. Then it might just be the lampposts go on at night. That's just the way things are. It would be nice if they switched off in the middle of the night so I could get some sleep. But, that's just the way things are. I'm not bothered about that. If you can put this on a whiteboard, and when people are proposing things to take forward as an action, it's useful to ask them, where do you think this action fits in these circles? Is it in the void? Can we not change it? We're never going to change the funding model of this team because that's the responsibility of the finance department. Or we need a better dev environment. We're not the team who builds that, so that goes into our circle of concern. Or we need to put in a Linda to stop this person going off and on big rants about style in code reviews. That's directly in our circle of influence. If you see too many things appearing in the void or in the circle of concern, you can ask as a facilitator, can this be broken down? Are there pieces of this action that can be moved into our circle of influence so that we can fix them? And if they say no, ask it a different way. Say, okay, you're concerned that there isn't a dev environment. What can you do to make that worse? And I guarantee you they'll always find a way that they can make a situation worse. And paradoxically, what that means is if you can make a situation worse, then you can influence it. And if you can influence it, not only can you make it worse, you can make it better. And that's like a really good kind of perspective shift to help people pull actions into the circle of influence so that they can actually enact this change. But there are a few things to be aware of and things that I fell foul of before. The first one is the Cobra effect. So this is when you come up with a solution to a problem. So you'll raise an action, and next time round, you'll find that actually that's made things worse. This can happen if your actions aren't directing root causes. So like, for example, if you're fixing that pull request process by saying everything needs to be done in a day, well, if you're not changing the size of the pull requests, if you're not changing the way that we organize work, all you've done is introduced a whole load of additional process and stress on the team. So you've got to be aware of making sure that you're actually targeting those root causes. Now, I personally like to put metrics of success against actions as well. And I think that's a really good way of being able to measure, are we moving towards resolving this problem, or are we moving away from it? And that can temper the effects of the Cobra effect as well by giving us that kind of, which direction is the needle moving. But it's also possible whenever you set metrics to gamify them. And Goodhart's law describes exactly that. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. The important thing about setting up metrics for retrospective actions is that you're not trying to reach the metric, you're trying to achieve some kind of outcome. The outcome is the target, and if the metric doesn't accurately represent that target, bin it, find another one. But just be aware that people can really, really gamify this stuff. And for that reason, I like to see actions from retrospective as actually experiments in and of themselves. And that might sound strange because I'm used to seeing actions like we're going to write a wiki page to describe this process, or we're going to send an angry worded email to this other team who keeps getting in the way. But they are, when you think about it, just guesses that will fix the problem. So I like to kind of, in the agile sense, embrace the uncertainty and formulate an action as a hypothesis. The nice thing about this process of going through gathering data, generating insights, then deciding what to do, is that you end up expressing challenges independent of a solution. And I think if you just have that three column setup with start, stop, and actions, you kind of lose that context of what is the problem we're trying to solve. You just jump straight into the solving. And that lets you write things as a hypothesis. So a challenge could be that we get interrupted at the middle of a sprint by the work of another team. We think that by sending an email to the team lead that describing the impact on this team, that this will resolve this problem. Because once you have a hypothesis, you can think about how to test that. And I like to ask, when I'm running a retro, I like to ask 2 questions of any action. I like to ask, how will you know if this will help the team? And how do you know if this is making things better? Because that's the point of a retrospective. We're trying to improve the process. So in this example, we think this will help the team if, let's say, we don't spend the last week of a sprint kind of having to reprioritize and dump everything we've done and accommodate these changes from another team. How will we know if this is making things better? Well, let's propose a kind of a metric of we'll achieve more story points in a sprint. As a first stab at this, we can then run this experiment and bring it back in a sprint later, and in the next setting the stage session say, okay, well, we achieved the same amount of story points and they did exactly the same thing. The email didn't work. And then that can be the focus of the next retrospective. The experiment continues with a different hypothesis. The experiment hasn't failed. I think we sometimes kind of attach more negative weight to experiments which don't provide the conclusions we want. So I like to say that an experiment hasn't failed. It's generated learning. We've learned something new, and that's important as well. And because I like to express actions as experiments, I try to discourage teams from taking forward too many actions, because if you're running too many experiments, it's like spinning plates. It just becomes more cognitively difficult the more of these that you have running, and the more likely they'll interfere with each other. My personal ideal action is 1, but some teams think that's too little and want to take on a bit more. But I'll always kind of make sure that they are comfortable taking the actions forward. And I also like to encourage the team take responsibility for the action. We very often kind of say, right, here's all the actions from a retro. Who's going to do this one? Who's going to do this one? What about this one? And really, we should always be considering the team, because it's about improving the team's process. So sure, you could maybe kind of assign one person to champion that action or to keep track of it over a sprint. That might be your scrum master. It might be a tech lead. It might be a QA. That's absolutely fine, but it shouldn't be the responsibility of an individual to achieve this action. And if you've gone through all of this, I mean, that can take an hour minimum. It can sometimes take 2-3 hours to go through that, depending on the size of your team. You will be drained, emotionally spiritually, mentally, all of this, it's a really taxing process going through a retrospective. And yeah, it can get emotional sometimes. It can get a bit fraught. So what I like to do is to close the retrospective in some kind of meaningful way that brings back that positivity, that leaves us on a good note, that wants people to come back the next time round as well. There's a couple of things we can do here. One of the things we did on my previous team was we, at the end of the retro, we kind of give ourselves 5 minutes to go on Know Your Meme and just generate like a meme for the sprint. And we printed it out and put it on the whiteboard. And everybody kind of had a bit of a laugh at that. Another thing I like to do is kind of just open the floor to show appreciation. And I don't mean you kind of go around and demand everybody thanks somebody else, but you just kind of start off, if you're running the retro, by choosing somebody and thanking them for something that they did. And it doesn't even have to be work related. It could be, you know, I really appreciate you buying me lunch the other day, you know. It's nice to spend some time with you outside of work. And just sit back. And what you'll find is that there'll be kind of that awkward 10, 15 seconds at the start. That sounds like an eternity. But people will eventually then kind of start thanking each other. And you'll find that sometimes that's quite profound as well. And again, it has an ebb and flow. You'll kind of know when it starts to trail off. And that's a real good point to then end the retrospective and let people go on a happy note. So that is a whirlwind tour of retrospectives. And I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you want to type them in, I'll happily answer anything that you want to ask me. Oh, and by the way, I will put these slides online as well, and I'll ping a link around. How would you restart retros when they've died off in the past? Reintroduce them to engage people to attend? Yeah, definitely. So I think if retrospectives have died off in the past, people are going to have preconceptions about kind of how a retrospective is performed and what's going to happen in those sessions. And it's kind of like when you're playing a new board game or when you're playing a new game, you kind of have that session zero type thing where you talk about the rules and how this is going to work and let people ask questions. And I think that's what you need to do. You need to just be really open and say, look, this has died off in the past. I want to start bringing retrospectives in again. This is how I see us running retrospectives going forward. This may also be a good point to do your kind of surveys, like your safety survey, or a happiness survey, or even just kind of asking people one-to-one, you know, what was it about the last retrospectives that you didn't like, and just trying to, again, as the person who wants to run them, understand what are the forces that are competing against this. It's really just about having conversations. Okay, the next one, is that the avatar from the Trapdoor cartoon series? That's amazing. That brings me back. Best suggestion for getting a team engaged who rely on a main dev and test lead and who are somewhat in a comfort zone of expecting those individuals to always speak or have the answers. So that's where the Liberating Structures book comes in. So all of the exercises in that book are available online. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read the book for free as well. I think it's like 12 quid to buy. It has a bunch of exercises in it, like the 1, 2, 4 all technique, which are really useful to kind of break out people into smaller groups so that they can feel comfortable about mentioning things. And again, to use board gaming terms, there's something called quarterbacking, which is where one person basically runs the thing, is the one who has the ideas, is the one who who you need to seek validation of to break an idea forward. And that kind of, you can kind of break up their monopoly on a retrospective by moving people into smaller groups and then collating ideas. So it's great that the tech is finally kind of catching up and enabling those kind of breakout things to happen. Because in the times we're in, it's not just a case of telling people to split off into different corners of the room, but I'd really look at stuff like 1, 2, 4 all as a way of kind of as breaking people out of that comfort zone. My favorite retro, good one. I do like the sprint timeline. I like it when people bring in data to a retrospective that's relevant to points that they're going to make, because that's really useful for helping people establish root causes. I like exercises that people can do during a sprint and then bring to a retro again, because it's really easy for people to just kind of identify a problem and then go, okay, well, I'll raise that in 2 weeks, I guess, if I remember, and then it never gets mentioned again. Whereas if you have some kind of physical artifact that people can see and you're putting events on it and you're drawing a graph about how happy you are, like that's a really good kind of thing to start a conversation in a retro. And I think anything that that breaks up the monotony of that 3-column structure is also really, really good, because that kind of confounds expectations and immediately kind of gets people thinking, oh, hang on, this is different. I want to be part of this. Okay, let's see if we have any more questions. Cool. Okay. Well, I think we now have time for a break. Where do you get your ideas from? So there's a couple of really great books. So this one here, the Agile Retrospectives book, is a really good kind of starting point for lots of exercises. Funretros.com is a really good one for community submitted exercises. It's really a case of looking around and seeing what's out there. There's even one person who does like do you know the HelloFresh veg boxes you can get every week? There's one person I found yesterday who does that and gives you a monthly retro in a box and gives you all of the material you need to conduct a retrospective. So there's loads of stuff out there. When I share the slides, you'll see some of the links that I've got in there. It is honestly just a case of looking around and picking what appeals. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go into the breakout room now. Let me try and find that retro in a box, and what I'll do is I'll tweet it, because it's probably going to take me a while to delve through my browsing history to find it. But yeah, I'll share that on my Twitter account, and yeah, I guess we can have a chat in the networking. So thank you all for joining this. Get your red cap, make retros great again, put it on, and hopefully your teams will be working better together next iteration. Thank you.